Hello, and welcome back to Symbols at Drummond Hill Cemetery in Niagara Falls. This video is part 2 of our exploration of symbols and ideas expressed on old gravestones at this amazing old cemetery. The previous video, which I highly encourage you to watch before this one if you haven't already, focused on some of the more common symbols you'll find there and at other 19th century cemeteries in southern Ontario. Today's video focuses on some of the less common symbols and motifs, as well as the emblems of a few organizations that can be spotted if you look closely. These symbols and motifs tell us a lot about 19th and early 20th century society and beliefs in Niagara Falls. I highly encourage you after watching this video to walk the cemetery yourself and try and find some of the stones featured here. On that note, let's get started. Let's begin with a really interesting and beautiful white marble stone. There are actually two stones of the same design here, but since the one on the right is in better condition, that's what we're looking at. This stone is for Peter Meissner, who died in 1838 at just 36 years old, and is on the north side of the cemetery. One of the things that strikes you when first seeing this stone is just how beautiful it is, even after circa 150 years. When you get close to it, you can see two willows, which as the last video highlighted were a symbol of mourning. In the middle is a woman leaning on a gravestone with an urn on top. She appears to have her hand on her head in a pose of grief and mourning. I've used an arrow to show you where the gravestone is in case you're having trouble spotting it. Once you spot the woman in the middle, you can see that the two willows not only reinforce the idea of grief and mourning, but also act as framing devices, directing our eyes toward the center. This kind of gravestone, which I like to call a mourning scene stone, is rare to come across since many of them were done in white marble, which proved very susceptible to the elements and modern pollutants over time. I don't think the meaning requires too much explanation beyond what's been said already. Suffice it to say that this kind of motif fit in well with and reflected a 19th century mourning culture that drew on a range of symbols from across the centuries and expressed itself in literature, mourning attire, and as we see here, gravestones. For the next stone, I'm going to make you get close and squint, but I wanted to include this unique stone because it follows along nicely with the one we just discussed. What you're looking at here is a human face. For a long time I thought the face might represent that of the deceased, James Campbell, who was a railroad laborer who died at 52 years old in 1871 in an accident. But after several visits to the cemetery and examining it from all angles, I believe it represents his wife. In this third photo, I've once again used arrows to point to the hair and slender shoulders, and although I can't be certain given its age and state, it even possibly looks like there may be a handkerchief, which would further express the idea of grief and mourning. Victorian mourning culture was very gendered and heavily directed at women, who bore the brunt of certain expectations about how they were to express grief and mourning. I'm going out on a limb here and suggesting that it is likely meant to represent the grief James's widow faced after his untimely and accidental death. It's tough to make out the details, but it's the kind of interesting challenge cemetery art often provides. Last in the theme of very artistic stones is this beautiful gravestone from the mid-19th century. This one has a medley of things going on, so please bear with me. I'm going to point to a lot of things with arrows, but will let you see it without any clutter at the end. First off, we need to notice the very large classical columns and arch representing a gate, which most often represents the gates of heaven. In the second close-up photo, notice the huge willow behind everything else. It goes down the whole height of the stone. In addition, as you can see, there's yet another urn on top of the gate. Lastly, in this very close-up photo, you can see a scroll, and above, an angel carrying it. Again, the stone is old and has eroded somewhat, so you'll have to examine it closely. I hope you can see what I'm talking about. Aside from the symbols we've already discussed, the scroll was often used on tombstones as an artistic panel for carving the inscription with the deceased's birth and death dates, etc., and in some cases it was meant to symbolize life. Thus, the overall idea here is an angel is carrying the person's soul through the gates of heaven. Once again, as in the previous video on symbols at Drummond Hill, We see a mixture of symbols of mourning balanced by symbols of hope, representing a confident belief in life after death. I've zoomed in on the whole stone a bit here and taken out the arrows so you can see what it looks like in full. Isn't it beautiful? The next symbol we're going to briefly examine is the palm branch. Many of us are familiar with palms from trips to tropical places, seeing them as plants in houses or offices, and of course in artwork. The palm branch is a beautiful symbol that, like many cemetery symbols, has roots dating back to antiquity. In ancient Egypt, for example, the palm represented immortality. Later on, it was also given to ancient Greek athletes who were victorious in competition. In 19th century cemeteries, the palm branch carries Christian connotations from the Gospel of John, associated with Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. It is also mentioned in the book of Revelation, chapter 7, verse 9, when a great multitude were said to stand before a throne and a lamb, symbolizing Jesus, holding palm branches in their hands. Thus, the palm symbol on 19th century gravestones usually symbolized victory, in the latter case over death. Like with willows, I enjoy examining and photographing all the different ways monument makers stylized palm branches, and I encourage you to have a close look at them too. For the second part of this video, we're switching it up and looking briefly at club and society emblems at Drummond Hill. Like in many other places across North America, citizens of Niagara Falls often belong to one or more club or society. Groups like the Freemasons, Oddfellows, Women's Christian Temperance Union, YMCA, and many others thrived during the late 19th and early 20th century. And in the cemetery, you can sometimes find evidence of who belonged to these groups by emblems on their tombstone. Since this is a short video, we're going to just discuss 2 emblems you can spot at Drummond Hill today. But there is much more available online through Google searches if you're interested in this subject. The first group, and one that often gets missed by those who don't visit old cemeteries often, is the Woodmen of the World. Founded in Omaha, Nebraska in 1890 by Joseph Cullen Root, the society was, and still is, a not-for-profit insurance society which dedicated itself to philanthropic projects and, most importantly for our discussion, the provision of tombstones for its members. As they are today, gravestones were a very expensive purchase for families. In fact, some people saved their entire life to ensure their family could afford a memorial. Having a gravestone, in addition to providing a tangible object for mourners to visit and pray at, also demonstrated social standing. To have one meant you weren't a pauper. To be buried in an unmarked grave was viewed as a social stain that many people did anything to avoid. The Woodmen, for their part, proudly declared that no member would rest in an unmarked grave. The Canadian Order of the Woodmen of the World, like its U.S. counterpart, provided gravestones which bore their emblem on it, as you can see in this photo, which highlights the sentence, "Erected by the Canadian Order of the Woodmen of the World." The emblem design varies, but always consists of at least a tree stump, and sometimes also has an axe, wedge, or laurel wreath. You can also sometimes even spot a dove. Although people are familiar sometimes with this group from distinctive limestone tree stumps and logs found at many cemeteries, at Drummond Hill and other cemeteries in the Niagara region, the Woodman stones were often done in granite. Though not as eye-catching, the granite stones pictured here have had the advantage of being very durable against the weather and pollution, making most of them still legible after over 100 years. In these photos, you can see both the emblem and an arrow pointing to the Latin phrase Dum tacet clamat, which is also translated on one stone into English as "He speaks though he be silent," a phrase similar in meaning to other epitaphs such as "gone but not forgotten," etc. For more information on this very interesting society, which is still around and thriving under the name Woodman Life, head to Google and search its name. I've included this last stone because it's a great example of the many sad but interesting stories you can find at Drummond Hill Cemetery. This stone is for a young fellow named William Stron, who was born in Brisbane, Australia in 1911 and sadly died at just 17 in 1929 from, according to his death record, acute streptococcal septicemia, that is, an infection in the bloodstream. Two things make William Stone unique. The first is that it describes what an Australian teenager was doing in Canada at that time. It reads that he died, quote, while on a tour of the United States and Canada with Young Australia League. Like its counterpart youth organizations throughout the world, the Young Australia League, founded in 1905 and still in existence, encouraged education through group activities and travel, similar to the Boy and Girl Scouts. Thus, we can conclude William was on a tour and sadly fell ill and died. The second unique element of his stone is the actual YAL emblem at the top, which consists of a kangaroo with a YAL shield inside of a bright sun. It's quite a beautiful emblem, and in all the cemeteries I've visited in Canada and elsewhere, this is the only example I've ever seen. The bottom of the stone states that it was erected by the boy members of the Boys Club Federation of America, a group now known more inclusively as the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. The cost of this memorial must have been significant, which makes it a sad but beautiful testament to how young William was remembered by other youth who were no doubt touched by his sudden death so far from home. We can only wonder if William's parents ever were able to visit his grave from distant Australia. That concludes the second part of this two-part series on symbols at Drummond Hill Cemetery. I hope you've enjoyed both videos and that you've learned a few things as well. Cemetery history encompasses so many other subjects, which means making difficult choices about what to include or exclude, often based on visual aids, i.e. gravestones that are still extant and can be photographed. If you're interested in learning more about Drummond Hill, I encourage you to contact the Niagara Falls Museum, and the internet, as usual, is also a great resource, though as with all information there, the validity and accuracy of some sites can be questionable, so be sure to seek out several sources and do some fact-checking. Lastly, I encourage you to visit Drummond Hill, whether you're a local or not. It's just down the road from the falls and is a great off-the-beaten-path place to learn about the history of the people who called the area home throughout the past 2 centuries and beyond. I'd like to thank the Niagara Falls Museum and staff for their help producing this video. If you're interested in more of my social media and offline activities, my Twitter and Instagram handles can be found at the end of this video. On that note, get out there and get exploring some old cemeteries. Thank you for watching.